Okay, people, we're going to get started. So good evening, and thank you for coming to the New Canaan Library. I'm Jocelyn Gladhorn, and I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator here at the library. We welcome the New Canaan Land Trust and author Susan Allport of Sermons in Stone. Our beautiful stone walls are the warp and weft of New Canaan, and we are delighted to have Ms. Allport here to share her knowledge about their history and their future. And now, Dieter Reef Snyder will take the podium to introduce Ms. Allport.
Thank you, Jocelyn, and it's really a great pleasure for the Land Trust to collaborate with the library in bringing you all here this evening. So first of all, welcome. We are very happy to see everyone and glad that you came out on this wintry evening. As Jocelyn said, I am Dieter Reef Snyder, and I would like to introduce you to our speaker tonight. The New Canaan Land Trust and the library have enjoyed putting this collaboration together to bring you all here. And Susan Allport Howell is going to speak about the history and the structure of the stone walls, which I suspect you guessed. Susan is an erudite science writer by background with a special interest in nutrition. She's written numerous books and articles in the science field. Her book on Sermons in Stone was a diversion from her métier, but grew out of her enduring interest in the landscape and the geological and sociological and political history of the walls and the area. I think you'll find her talk tonight fascinating. She's a former resident of New Canaan and spent her childhood romping around the woods near Colonial Drive, up near what is now the Land Trust W. Pritchard Brown Wildlife Sanctuary, and near the group's reservoir adjacent to that area. It was a formative time when she began to wonder about the stone walls that were winding through the woods. But she may not have known it when she was a child that the woods were newer than the stone walls. The colonial farmers had built the stone fences, clearing the virgin forest to make the pastures that contained their crops and their livestock. She and her husband, David Howell, who did the charming illustrations for her book, have also been recently very involved in an extensive renovation of miles and miles of stone fences at the Henry Morgenthau Preserve in Katona. So she's here tonight to speak to us both about the history and the restoration of stone walls as a part of the Land Trust Gateways to New Canaan program. The epigraph that she chose for Sermons in Stone is from Shakespeare's As You Like It, and it concludes, "And this our life, exempt from public haunt, finds tongues in trees and books in running brooks, sermons in stones, and good in everything." So ladies and gentlemen, here to help us look for the good in everything is Susan Allport.
Thanks for that charming introduction. And it is wonderful to be back here where, as Dita pointed out, I first spent time with any stone walls, so back in New Canaan. I'd like you to close your eyes for a moment and try to imagine New Canaan and Connecticut and New York without their stone walls. Imagine that you're walking or driving down some favorite stretch of wall-lined road, and then eliminate those walls. Replace them with brush, perhaps nothing. Consider then just how much the walls add to our landscape. Scale, rhythm, design, not to mention a sense of history and the past. In 1871, according to a United States Department of Agriculture survey, there were some 252,000 miles of stone walls in the states of New York and New England combined. And yes, you can open your eyes now. 252,000 miles of walls. Enough stone wall to circle the earth 10 times, more miles of walls than there are miles of railroad tracks in the entire United States today. New York alone had some 95,000 miles, Massachusetts 33,000, Connecticut 20,000.
It used to be said that 2 men and a pair of oxen could lay about 10 feet of stone wall a day, and that was an estimate that included the time it took to gather stones and dig a foundation. At that rate, it would have taken 15,000 men, 243 years to lay all these walls. The work that went into these pragmatic, commonplace structures would have built the pyramids of Egypt 100 times over. 25 years or so ago, when I first began to entertain the notion of writing a book on stone walls, I had no idea what I was going to find. The subject was actually my husband's, and when he first suggested it to me on one of our walks in the woods, I was extremely dubious. I was a science writer, as Dee Dee said, and I doubted that there could be enough meat on a stone wall's bones, so to speak, to build a book around. I was really stepping into the unknown. So little had been written about walls at the time, I was worried that it would turn out that there was very little to write, that I would commit myself to this subject, find nothing, and then wind up writing a light and frothy style book, which was my particular secret dread. But all the time I was debating on whether or not to write on this subject, I was intrigued by a central contradiction regarding walls. On the one hand, walls are everywhere, endless. On the other, so little was known about them. Like many of us, I sensed that they must have stories to tell, but for the moment, they were everywhere but mute, evocative but silent. I knew, of course, that they were part of New York and New England's agricultural past, the ruins of that past, so to speak. But surely their history didn't begin and end there. Who had built these walls and why? Did they just mark property lines, as is often said? Or were these tumbling down structures once effective barriers against cows and sheep? And how did the people who built the walls view their labors? How did they see the stones they removed from their fields? Where did they think those stones had come from? Were stone walls a good kind of fence, or just something the farmers of this area had to make do with? Could anyone build a stone wall, or was it a task you had to have a specific knack or talent for? In order to get the answers to these questions, I knew I was going to have to cast a very wide net. Once I decided to go ahead, I wrote to hundreds of historical societies and libraries asking if they had any information regarding walls. These were the pre-internet days, of course, and all this took a lot of time and stamps. Considering the quantity of wall that existed where each of these libraries was located, it was amazing that most wrote back saying they had nothing whatsoever on the subject. Some, however, sent small but very tantalizing tidbits. The Little Compton Historical Society in Rhode Island sent an excerpt from the town records of Plymouth from 1672, in which an Indian squaw was given a fine of building 20 poles of stone wall as partial payment for a 25-pound debt she owed to one John Almy. A pole or a rod, by the way, is a unit of measurement of 16.5 feet. The New Haven Historical Society sent a page from the court records of 1653 in which the settlers of New Haven promised to build a fence around the cornfields of the local Indians. In return, the Indians pledged to do no more damage to the English cattle and to secure their own corn from damage in the future or to require none. A North Salem historian gave me a page from the records from the account book of one of her ancestors, in which it was noted that in 1787, a slave named Robin was given a credit of 32 shillings for making stone fence and for 4 days of carting stone. It was not a lot of material, but it was enough to start shaking my preconceptions about stone walls and send me digging in many different profitable directions. I started out thinking of stone walls simply as picturesque byproducts of our agricultural past, as inextricably tied to the Yankee farmer and his labors as an ox to a plow. But with each new piece of information, I came to see that they were in fact much more complex objects with a much more complex past, that they had been built by slaves and Indians as well as Yankees, that their very existence was due as much to deforestation during the colonial period as it was to the amount of stone dumped on the area by the glaciers thousands of years ago. Okay, now I can get to this. Oh. Okay. Maybe this will do it. There we go. I won't use the pointer. 100 years ago, much of New England and New York looked something like this. About 75% of the land was cleared and in agricultural production or pasture, and much of that land was divided by stone walls into fields sometimes no larger than an acre. This picture was taken at the turn of the century from the site of what used to be the Tea House in North Salem, New York, a place where visitors used to come for these vistas of fields, fences, and on a clear day, the Long Island Sound. Here's the same site just 80 years later. I took this in 1988. And it shows how quickly land usage patterns in this part of the world have been reversed. Now only about 15 to 20% of the land is cleared, and 75 to 80% of it is covered in second growth timber. Now only the walls remain to tell the tales of those earlier agricultural times. Here we are in the woods off of Barnegat Road in Pound Ridge. And as you can see, there's a similar density of walls running through these woods as there was in the view from the tea house. This density shows how intensively this area was once cultivated. It also reveals something of the agricultural philosophy of the farmers who did that cultivating. Early farmers had a strong belief that small fields produce best, and so they tended to divide their land into small areas. Those small areas served them well in terms of the fencing laws of the time and in terms of crop rotation, breeding, pasturing, and all the other manual agricultural techniques of the 17th and early 18th centuries. But they quickly lost their advantages with the advent of horse and then steam-powered machinery. In order to use the new, larger, and more efficient machinery, farmers had to undergo the back-breaking task of taking down the stone walls that divided their land. On land that has been farmed continuously since the 1700s, you will not see small walled fields like these, and that's because the walls have been removed so that the fields could be enlarged. But because many of these farms were abandoned at exactly the time that these changes in agricultural machinery were taking place, and in some part because of these changes and the labor involved in dismantling the walls, the era of small fields, the belief in small fields, is now preserved in our woods. The attitude that small fields produce best is certainly one of the chief factors contributing to the abundance of walls that can be seen today, but there are other factors as well. New York and New England's thick covering of glacial debris is of course one, and who here is not aware of the rocks in these soils? Bits and pieces of the Appalachian Mountains and the Hudson Highlands that were carried down and left by one or the other of the Pleistocene ice sheets. I'll come back to the glaciers, but first I'd like to talk about yet another factor that is less appreciated, and that is deforestation. When the first European settlers started farming in this area, they were confronted with somewhat the same abundance of wood we see today. It was more wood than they knew what to do with. So much wood that early settlers were convinced that it would last forever, no matter how they used it. And they used it very poorly. Oftentimes land was cleared for farming by burning in much the same way that some farmers in the tropics clear rainforests today. And by the standards of the day, the settlers heated their homes in profligate ways. The trees came to mean, as one columnist put it, being warm in winter, warmer even than the nobility of England could hope to be. I think we can all appreciate that. So fencing reflected this profligacy. Settlers first used whole logs and stumps for fencing. Later on, they developed the most wasteful form of fencing imaginable, the worm, snake, or zigzag fence, a portable rail fence that required neither posts nor holes. The worm fence, as you can see, is built of split rails that are laid in a zigzag fashion, with their ends interlocking at an angle of 60 degrees. It required a maximum of lumber and land. Because it zigzagged, it took up a great deal of land that could have otherwise been cultivated, but a minimum of time and labor. 2 men could split and lay 200 yards of this kind of fencing a day, and so the worm fence spread like wildfire throughout the colonies. Here's another form of the worm fence, which has stakes at each interlocking joint. And here's a worm fence in winter, which shows so clearly how much land was occupied by this kind of fencing. As long as there were logs to be split, the worm fence, the worm fence remained the most popular form of fencing. But that wasn't very long. All but the newest settlements experienced wood shortages by the time of the American Revolution. An alternative to the wasteful worm fence was needed, and fortunately for the farmers, they didn't have far to look. For decades, they had been picking and hauling stones out of their fields and piling them up on their property and field lines. These were the makings of a new kind of fence, the stone wall. It was more labor-intensive than the worm fence, but it didn't need to be replaced every 20 years. And like the worm fence, it didn't require post holes, an important consideration in many parts of New England and New York, where bedrock is so close to the surface. Today, the stone wall seems inevitable to us, the only logical response to a need to fence on the one hand and an abundance of stone on the other. But its appearance on the landscape was due far less to the forces of logic and reason than to widespread deforestation. Without that deforestation, most of our walls might never have been built. Indeed, many of the stones in these walls might never have been brought to the surface, since trees insulate the soil and keep frost from penetrating and heaving up deeply embedded rocks. Today, you will sometimes hear it say that stone walls are nothing more than stone piles made into lines and that they serve no fencing purpose whatsoever. But the next 2 slides show the fallacy of this idea, for they are of zigzag stone walls in Bethlehem and Woodbury, Connecticut. And they show clearly how the stone wall came to replace the zigzag fence over time. When the farmer had this zigzag fence and the stones kept coming up from the ground, he piled them next to the wooden rail fence. And then eventually he would have, if he had kept this land going, farming, he would have straightened out those zigzag stone walls. But because this land was abandoned at this time, we now have these zigzag walls in the woods, which are pretty neat. Here's another one. And here is a slide of a rock pile in Pound Ridge Reservation, which is a pile created by a farmer but never turned into a wall. Piles like these are very common in our woods because even after farmers had built all the walls they needed, the rocks did keep coming out of the soil, and they had to be put somewhere. Sometimes they were piled next to an existing fence or wall, as with those zigzag stone walls. And sometimes they were stacked on top of an unmovable boulder. I especially love coming across these piles in the woods because they speak to me even more eloquently, perhaps, of the endless labors of the early farmers. Also, I'm pretty sure that the last person who touched any of these rocks was himself one of those farmers. These rock piles bring us back to the glaciers and the fact that much of New England and New York is and was littered with rocks, and that there was a time when this whole area was covered with an ice sheet, in some places almost a mile thick. Here's an illustration my husband did for our book on stone walls, showing what an ice sheet of that thickness looks like in relation to something that maybe will be recognizable to many of you, the Hartford skyline. The next slides are of contemporary glaciers, which I've included to give some idea of how glaciers scour away at a mountain and how they've shaped much of our landscape. Compare this slide of a contemporary Swiss glacier, for example, with this piece of glacially smooth bedrock in Pound Ridge. It was Louis Agassiz, the Swiss paleontologist, who first proposed the then startling theory that at one time, not very long ago, 1/3 of the Earth had been covered with ice. Most of his contemporaries ridiculed this idea and told him to go back to his earlier study of fossil fishes. But Agassiz persisted, eventually bringing his theories to this country. This is a drawing that Agassiz did for one of his first publications on glaciation, and it's intended to show how ice flows move over mountains, stripping them of any soft or rotten rock and carrying that rock along with them. In the same way glaciers on this continent stripped and wore down the mountains we now know as the Green Mountains of Vermont and the White Mountains of New Hampshire. There's a somewhat ironic footnote to the Agassiz story, and that's that Agassiz, who had to fight so hard to have his iconoclastic views on glaciers accepted, was one of the main opponents of Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution, which goes to show that you may be right some of the time in this world, but you're rarely right all of the time. Now, the rocks that the glaciers moved around ranged in size from that of a pea to small houses. All are called erratics because they are found in locations far from where they originated, and glacial erratics because, of course, the glaciers moved them from their point of origin. Before it was understood that the area had been once blanketed by ice sheets, people were greatly mystified by the largest of these, rocks like these, the Cathedral Rocks in Springfield, Vermont, and the Balanced Rock in North Salem. They were called curiosities, and some thought that they were the tombs of early Viking sailors or ancient Celts, while others maintained that Indians had moved them around for now obscure religious reasons. As the theory of widespread glaciation took hold in the middle of the 19th century, many of these alternative ideas lost much, but not all of their popularity. They're still around today, as evidenced by such books as America BC and The Search for Lost America, or by signs that certain stones and stone structures have been used in solstice celebrations. I was bicycling in Carmel shortly after the summer solstice one year and came upon a root cellar much like this one by the side of the road. When I went inside, it was strewn with flowers that had just begun to fade, and it was obvious that people had spent the night in it, marking the solstice. Now, farmers built cellars like this in order to keep their root crops through the winter, and they needed especially large cellars in the day before silage, when they fed turnips and mangowurzels to their animals all winter long. That piece of history has been largely lost, and now some people prefer to think that these cellars were built by Celts. The fact that most of the cellars face east and line up with the rising sun solidifies their belief. But the cellars face east, of course, so that the roots inside wouldn't freeze. To a farmer, a glacial erratic was more of a nuisance than a point of interest. Indian farmers had also had to deal with these rocks, but they had done it by either cultivating around them or choosing to plant in relatively rock-free areas to begin with, the floodplains of rivers, for example. European settlers were adopting a new approach. As part of their justification for taking the land away from the Indians, they were going to improve it, they said, by clearing it of trees and rocks and by enclosing it. I should point out that the Indians had no need to enclose their crops since they didn't keep domesticated animals, but this point was lost on the settlers. When it came time to building stone walls, colonial farmers did not have a long-standing wall-building tradition. That sounds surprising, but remember, stone wall building really took off in the late 1700s and early 1800s, long after immigration from England, a country with many wall builders and a well-established wall building tradition, had slowed down. So New Englanders and New Yorkers had to approach the task of wall building through experimentation and trial and error. They were looking for a structure that was both easily built and would stand a long time. Many factors entered into a wall's construction: the type of stone that was available, what the wall was supposed to do. Was it intended to keep the occasional stray out of the corn, or did it have to stand up to the daily abuse of a large number of hungry creatures? The farmers of this area developed different walls for different purposes and situations. But for the most part, these walls can be grouped into three basic categories: single, double, and rubble walls. Single walls, such as the wall in the middle, are made up of a single layer of stone. They're quickly built, and they're the kind of wall you see most commonly running through the woods. Sometimes they're called thrown walls, as opposed to laid walls or double walls like the wall on the left. Those walls are much more carefully built and were oftentimes trenched, and they're at least 2 stones thick. The third type of wall, the rubble wall on the right, is a kind of stone sandwich with layers of good-sized stones at either face and a filling of smaller stones in between. Double walls are the kind of walls that would have been built to front a house, since they're the more finished-looking walls, and they could be constructed to stand 4 feet high, the height of most of the fencing walls of the time. They're also the kind of wall that would have been used as a foundation for a barn or a house, or to form a paddock, or a pound, an animal pound, or to surround a cemetery. New Yorkers and New Englanders learned to put their time and effort into the walls that counted most, and they built double walls where they counted. Rubble walls are less common in many areas, but they're very useful where there is a wide diversity of stone, lots of small and large stones. Rubble walls also maintain themselves very well, since they tend to be built with a strong angle or batter, so that when they do collapse, they collapse inwards and keep their basic shape. In places where stone wasn't so plentiful, a kind of hybrid half-stone wall, half-wooden fence was common, like this one, this very low stone wall with stakes and riders on top of it. By now, of course, the wood on this fence would have long rotted, leaving only a very low, 2-foot-high stone wall. Seeing this, most people would say, but that's much too low a wall to keep any kind of animal in or out. That wall must have been just built to mark a property line. This is a very common misconception, and you can see how easily it might originate. As I said, farmers started building their walls by trial and error, but before too long, a few truisms or fundamentals of wall building began to emerge. One of these was the importance of laying one stone on top of two stones and two stones on top of one in order to tie the wall together and prevent the creation of rivers or seams, places where a wall would tend to pull apart. Another was to place stones in the wall the way that they would naturally roll, i.e. with their centers of gravity perpendicular to the direction, with their centers of gravity down. Also to place the length of the wall perpendicular to the long side of the stone perpendicular to the length of the wall. Wall builders ignored these three fundamentals at their peril. Any wall builder who built a wall that is still standing after 10, 50, or 100 years paid careful attention to them. Much more attention, unfortunately, than is being paid today. Here's one of our more famous neighbors' walls, and here's a section of that wall that collapsed shortly after it was built. As you can see, the stones are stacked side by side in this wall rather than being tied together in any kind of overlapping fashion. They're like two slices of bread. That's the way that a rubble wall is also built, with the stones, so the outer stones are side by side, but a rubble wall tends to have much more of an angle than these walls that are not standing well. This way of building is increasingly common in our area because it's fast and relatively easy to put together. Here's a second example, also in Bedford, New York. But you can see that there's nothing that's going to keep this wall together and enable it to resist the heaving effects of frost and even road traffic. As I said, it might be all right if it had much more of an angle or batter, but it's not all right as this upright structure. Even even more egregious fault that is common among wall builders today is to put a stone in the wall against their center of gravity, as this stone in the middle has been placed. Both frost heaves and the laws of gravity are working against this stone. No farmer would have ever placed it this way. Those are three most important fundamentals of wall building that emerged early on. But there are other techniques that farmers learned to keep their walls standing, such as building the walls with the strong batter or angle, and the use of that's the angle, the batter, and the use of very large stones at the corner of a wall or to define a barway. For example, this cornerstone at Hook Road in Katona, where I live, or this natural barway stone in the woods, or this handsome man-made barway at the John Jay Homestead. A barway, of course, is a gap in the wall where a wagon can pass, and wise farmers used very large stones in their construction so that the wall wouldn't be pulled apart every time a wagon wheel caught on it. Another technique that helps a wall to stand the test of time is the use of through stones, large stones that span the width of the wall and act to hold it together. New Englanders and New Yorkers were not nearly so picky about through stones as farmers in England itself, where the number of through stones in a wall is often carefully specified in any wall building contract. However, many of our farmers did adopt and come to swear by a special type of through stone, and that is the capping stone, a large flat stone that sits on top of the wall, thereby preventing leaves and other debris from entering the wall, where they would absorb moisture, freeze, and eventually force the wall apart. The weight and the span of the capping stone also helps to hold that wall together. I think it's because I live near the Cross River Reservoir that I'm so aware of the usefulness of capping stones. The wall around the reservoir was built in around 1903 to keep the cows out of the reservoir. Of course, time was going to see to all those cows very shortly. But this wall was built with stone that was obtained from the blasting of the dams, for the stone for the dams, and the specifications for this wall are in the records, and you can see that one can see that this wall has been trenched to 2 feet deep, that there's substantial trenching below these walls, and it stands beautifully. Here's another even more astonishing example of the advantages of large capping stones. And this is a walking wall in the Ward Pound Ridge Reservation. And a walking wall, of course, would have been built by the farmer so that one could get from the house to the barn or to the carriage without going through the muddy soil at most of the times of the year. So it would have been a very nice way to get to your carriage from your house. You can see that these are huge stones that are on top of this walking wall, but when you look at the wall from the side, it's really just a jumble of much smaller stones that are held in place by those large flat stones on top. And here it is from another angle. You can see it's not a very substantial looking wall except for those capping stones. By contrast, here a few walls with what is called a piece cap, which are very small pieces of stone on top of a wall. And those stones are easily displaced by deer, children, frost, etc. And this wall will just, decay very quickly. And here's a stonemason working on a very long stone wall that surrounds Ralph Loren's estate in Katona. And this should be all the wall that money could buy, but you can see the problem with this kind of cap. that all that stuff is just going to get into it and force the stone apart. Now here's a wall down the street from Ralph Lauren's wall, and it has the same kind of stone that Lauren had to deal with, this very rounded, cobbly stone that's difficult to build with. And when this homeowner wanted to rebuild his wall, his architect suggested removing all the stone and replacing it with flat tabular stone from Pennsylvania. But he called me up and he asked whether I thought that was a good idea. And I told him I thought it was a pity because it would really lose the sense that there had been a fast-moving river in this area that had created all this rounded stone. So I said to him, why don't you build up those rounded stones and then use the big flat stones on top of it? And it's very fun to spend somebody else's money, but he did as I suggested, and it really turned out to be a nice wall. It stands very well. And probably was less expensive for him too. Now, I don't want to leave you with the impression that all walls need capping stones, and here is a wall that many of you will recognize. It's a wall my husband and I call the Idaho potato wall. And it's on Oak Ridge in New Canaan. It's now hidden behind a wall of trees. I think it's hidden. I saw the trees, but there's so much snow I can't tell if the stones themselves are hidden. But all these large stones were brought up during the excavation for this house, and somebody had the wit to turn them into this very memorable wall. Here's another view of that wall. So far, I haven't introduced the terms dry wall and wet wall. A dry wall is a wall built without any mortar or cement, and all of the walls we've seen so far have been dry walls, since the farm walls were all built in the dry wall tradition. Wet walls only came into fashion as farming died out in New England and New York, and the area came to be occupied by new waves of estate and homeowners. Wet walls were supposed to solve all of the problems of dry walls, the fact that frost plays havoc with a dry wall shape. But as you can see, wet walls present their own problems. Whereas a dry wall can move as the earth moves, a wet wall will crack apart if it's put under too much stress, or if water gets into the cement. And repairing a wet wall is obviously much more difficult than repairing a dry wall. This is a wall in Bedford, near where I live, and it sat there in this condition for years and years and years, and I could just imagine the homeowners scratching their heads, how am I going to fix that? The same set of problems also applies to a technique I've seen recently of applying cement to just the upper course of a wall. When the bottom of this wall shifts, the mortar cracks apart and again is a nightmare to repair. I'm going to end this presentation on a somewhat odd note. These next slides are also about the history of stone walls in this area, but you won't see a single wall in them. This is a view of the Pound Ridge Reservation in Cross River, and here's a view of the outhouse orchards in North Salem. What do these slides have to do with walls, you might ask? They both show areas where the stone walls have been taken down. When the Pound Ridge Reservation was created in the early 1900s, stone walls were out of date and out of fashion. So many of them were removed and used to build the many stone structures on the reservation. In the case of the outhouse orchards, the walls were also taken down by the outhouse family, but in order to enlarge the fields to facilitate spraying, pruning, picking, all the operations of the orchard. But the outhouses did something different with their stones from their walls. They buried them and turned them into stone drains. Drew Outhouse took me on a tour of these now invisible walls, and he said that one used to run right here where you see the tracks, and that he can still hear the rain, the water running when it's raining. All right, second, I've lost some. Just a second. Where did I lose my last note? So I think I can recreate it, but put them somewhere. Anyway, these last slides tell us that stone walls do go in and out of favor. They also begin to show us what our landscape would look like without these structures, and what a loss that would be. Stone walls give the appearance of being indestructible because, of course, they're made of stone. But anybody who's observed their slow disappearance over time sees how really fragile they are. Few stone walls are of great historic significance in and of themselves. Few stone walls are works of great beauty in and of themselves. But just as a wall is made up of many stones, so our sense of the historic and aesthetic value of walls is made up of many walls. Something of that is lost with the loss of each wall. And you never know what future generations will make of stone walls. This slide is of an Army map from 1943, 2 years after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, when the map service of the United States Army mapped all the stone walls in the area in the event that they might come in useful as bunkers, as they've been used during the American Revolution. And this last slide it's of a sculpture by my husband, David Howell, the illustrator. And it's he used an existing stone wall to mount what he calls the stone cloud. It pivots on a. So, thank you very much. I am open to any questions.
Any questions? Yes, please.
I'm a builder. I was when I was working, and I'm a stone wall nut. And if you want to see the nicest stone wall that I have ever seen, and I've traveled all over the world, it's in Rowayton. It's on Wilson Avenue and Highland Avenue. It used to be the president of U.S. Steel. Every stone has 5 sides. Every single stone. And the cap is carved granite. It's a work of art that's about a half a mile long.
Wow, that's neat. My husband grew up in Rowayton. He might remember that.
He knows that place.
Okay, that's neat. Thanks for telling me about it.
Did you find any consistency in terms of the heights of the stone wall or any reasoning for the heights?
Well, the fencing laws.
And would there have been any consistency to what was made in England or overseas to what was made here?
Well, you had the tradition of people coming from overseas, but actually I don't know that. I've never looked at the fencing laws from England, but the fencing laws in this country were mostly 4 feet and 4.5 feet. So that's, the consistency has to do with the animals that they were trying to contain, but that's interesting. I've never looked at those heights in England itself. Yes?
Have you ever heard of a stone wall that's been built, I don't know how long ago, which is about 8 feet tall and 4 feet wide on each side of the road? It is the entrance to a town in Connecticut.
No, I haven't heard of that. Oh my gosh. And that would probably have been used to drive sheep or cattle through it, and they didn't want them escaping. Yeah.
Your book is a lot of fun to read. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Extremely entertaining. A lot of the towns around here encourage, the zoning regulations encourage stone walls to be used as property lines for future lots. And but what they don't carry with them is the respective responsibility of the property owners next door to each other as to how to handle those stone walls. So I wondered if you had any thoughts on people rustling stones away, which happens.
Yeah, right. Or the fence mending, which Robert Frost wrote about, and getting out there. I mean, very few neighbors would be doing this. But I will say that if you do, without going to the expense of really rebuilding your walls, but if you do just pick them up, you'll find that the stone is sticking around. You're not going to lose it. And when you do go to actually rebuild a wall, it will be much more available to you if you do pick it up on a regular basis. So, yes, it will be hard to convince your neighbor to do the same. But in the past, there were specific days when neighbors would go back out side by, on each side of a wall and pick up that wall. Yes?
Has anyone done any kind of mapping of stone walls? You mentioned 3 states. Or, I'd love to see the density of them and how far west.
Well, you can get the Army maps, and they have all of the area all charted out. I was just sent that one from the Teton Reservation, but they exist for the whole area. So those would have been the stone walls that were existent in 1942. Yes?
Did you ever come across the descriptor Indian wall in your studies of stone walls?
Well, I came across a lot of references to Indians building walls for colonists, but they did not build walls for themselves because there was no need to they didn't keep the domesticated animals. And what would that mean to you, the Indian wall?
I live in a very old house here in New Canaan, and shortly after my wife and I bought the house, and some people would come by and be curious and or want to introduce themselves. And more than one person said, "Oh my gosh, you have Indian walls."
Mm-hmm.
At this house. And
Yeah.
I don't know what that means.
Yeah, the walls weren't on the landscape before the colonists came in, and very soon thereafter Indians were building walls for,
Our particular house dates back to commencement in 1732 and 1735.
Yeah. No. Yes?
Inside the rocks, has there been any?
limestone wall behind the house.
Oh, maybe we can see.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I
We'll get
noticed
back.
the smell of the stones. When you crunch 2 stones together, you get a particular smell. And that is the very same smell that you get out of rain when it hits stone, like a roadway or a pathway. So I concluded that the smell of rain is really the smell of stone.
I've never heard that.
You were going to talk some more about the glaciers, because in the Green Mountains and New Hampshire also, those mountains used to be 12 to 14,000 feet tall,
Yeah.
and the glacier moved them in Vermont about 20 miles west. They're over near the New York border.
Oh, gosh. And
That's proven,
yeah. Yep, I mean, that's why we have so much rock. Yes.
I was just wondering about the insides of the rocks. Has there been any geodes and discoveries of really interesting internals or quartzes that have been mined in the past?
Oh, gosh, let's see. I mean, you'll find all of those geodes in the walls. People have mentioned that they have, but I think if somebody saw a really interesting thing, they took it into their house rather than leaving it in their wall. I'm trying to think. I know that people have mentioned
The
that.
reason why I asked that about the Indian walls is I had heard a rumor in Ridgefield, Connecticut, that there had been a colony of Indians that got chased out because of the Connecticut quartz that the colonialists had found there, and said, "Oh, this is highly valuable to us," and started mining it and blasting it and sort of changed the landscape. And so the Indians left, and I didn't dial in on that in history, just something I heard.
Right. No, I haven't heard that, but that's interesting. Yeah. Yes.
Some of these stone walls around our house are very large stones in there.
I can't imagine a farmer with one or two other people could have even moved it. I mean, you don't really talk about how they did move it. You talk about a couple oxen. I'm telling you, a couple oxen could have moved these rocks. And how they went about, I mean, you can gather a stone, you can find it, you can dig it up. But to move it, what did they do?
What did they do? Well, they had the oxen, and then they'd come up with really ingenious techniques like laying down grasses that made the rock a little more slippery, or working in the winter when there was snow cover so that they could drag the rocks more easily that way. But, I spend the weekends watching my husband move incredibly big stones. But he does have machines, but he constructed a lot of these things for lifting out of things that a farmer would have had. So it's not undoable. I have a chapter in the book about some of the accounts of moving the stone. But Archimedes said, "Give me a lever and I can move the world," and that's what they were doing. Yes.
As someone who spent time in New Canaan, are you familiar with the perambulation line?
Yeah.
Do you know where it is?
No, I don't know where it is, but I'm familiar with that, and that people used to be responsible for walking the lines of the towns. Yeah.
You know where it is.
Oh, okay.
The perambulation line runs through the high school property. And so if you were to, between the Y and the high school, there's a line that runs all the way down to, I guess it would be it's really divided Norwalk and Stamford in terms of where you pay your taxes. And so the perambulation line is it is a stone wall, it's a dry wall. And if you just walk into Waveney Park, and you start, if you come in from around the Mormon Church, and you take the path north, and then take a look on the right side, and you'll see it stops at the Parkway. And I assume it starts on the other side of the Parkway. Yeah. So it's very interesting. So the perambulation line.
Yeah, a lot of towns had that, and yes, in the back.
What about nicknames for the walls or the rocks? Growing up, we were told we were just harvesting Connecticut potatoes.
Lots of.
Was there any, across New England and New York, were there sayings or expressions for having?
So many. I've got so many in the book. It was a while ago, so I can't. When you grow, oh gosh, I just can't come right up with them. But they had sayings, when you buy land, you buy stones. When you buy, potato. Oh, when you buy meat, you buy bones. When you buy land, you buy stones. All kinds of things like that. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. It was a great turnout.
That was a great treat to have Susan come and talk to us about stone walls. And Susan, we have a small little commemorative gift for you from New Canaan Zone, from New Canaan High School. It's not a stone, but it's a red cedar emblazoned with the New Canaan Land Trust logo on it. It was harvested locally, and the high school did the engraving for us, and we'd like to present this to you. One sniff, it's New Canaan.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
Brings it all back.
Just a quick word to you all, thanking you all for coming out. I believe stone walls are a very important piece of scenic New Canaan, and as Land Trust President, I'm lucky to be steward of many, many miles of stone walls. The Land Trust is going to start launching a program at rebuilding stone walls. We have asked the New Canaan Community Foundation for a grant to let us do a demonstration of it, and we think if we can set the example of how good dry stone walls are set, more people will take that up, and that will have a more consistent look. Keep posted. In about 8 weeks, we're going to offer a course on rebuilding your dry stone wall. Craig Falacci, who is a dry stone wall builder, has offered to take some time out to teach us that. We'll send an announcement out in about 8 weeks when the weather gets a little nicer. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for supporting the Land Trust.
That was great, yeah.
What is that?
I know. I'm going to take this.
Have to be the chairman of State Council. We are going to be going to the Connecticut Land Conservation Conference. Are you going to be there? Okay. Yeah. Tyler, trying to make connections between what there is a very strong connection between